Hey guys, in today's video, I'll be giving my tips on how I wrote my history IA in score to 7. I'll be making a video next week breaking down my own IA, so subscribe to stay tuned for that. Tip number 1, coming up with an IA topic. Wikipedia is really your best friend when it comes down to trying to find an idea or a topic to write for history. Say you're interested in writing about Stalin. Go on Wikipedia, look up Stalin, and what you'll find on his Wikipedia page is a whole bunch of information about him with links. So you can click away to these other links, but what I actually like to do is I'll scroll down to contents. So looking through this, one of the ideas that immediately popped to mind is like consolidation of power. So I would click this. Here it gives you more information about how he consolidated power. And what you could do is you could focus on one way he consolidated power. For instance, how did he use propaganda to consolidate power? If you keep scrolling, you might see something like his first 5-year plan. Now, if you look at the 5-year plan, you can also look at its contents, and you can see down here in legacy, successes, and failures. So you can also talk about why the plan succeeded or why it failed in your IA and make that like the success of 5-year plans a IA topic. Having a Wikipedia page is really helpful because number 1, Wikipedia has a section called references. Using this reference section, you can actually find physical books that you can cite and use as sources for your history IA, because IB doesn't want you using Wikipedia as a source. But here, Wikipedia has a whole collection of sources that's relevant to the topic that you might be interested in writing about. And this gives you a good idea of how many sources you can find for your topic, whether or not it's plausible for you to write an entire IA on this subject, and you can actually comb through this list of references to find a source for your IA. Wikipedia is also a good way to just judge if the topic is a good idea for an IA. If a Wikipedia page doesn't exist for your topic, I'm not saying that you can't write an IA on the topic, but it would be slightly harder. If the Wikipedia page for your topic has a decent number of sources, then this will be a huge helper during your IA writing process. Another way to come up with good history IA topics is to browse exemplar IAs. Doing this will give you a good idea of how specific and narrow your topic should be, and it also gives you a good idea of what type of evidence that you need to find and provide for your IA. For instance, there could be statistics that you should be looking out for as you're reading your sources. For instance, you could quote a historian's stance on your IA and elaborate on whether or not you agree or disagree, etc. Also, just read through 1 or 2 exemplars so you know what your IA should eventually turn out to look like. Note how the ideas are structured and presented with nuance to show complexity. Also note down how long the sections are and how everything is generally organized. This shouldn't be a hard standard. You don't have to follow the exemplar IA to the T, but it's a good reference. I used a lot of exemplar IAs when I was writing my section A, where we're supposed to evaluate sources, because I really had no idea how to write a section A for my history IA. Another resource I also used was the history textbook, because that had an entire list of sentence stems that I could use and different angles to evaluate a historian or a primary and secondary source. The IB history textbook also has a list of guidelines on how to write an overall history IA, so this is also really helpful. Tip number 2, start writing from the middle. So this might sound unconventional, but it's actually a really good idea that I used when I was writing my history IA, because what I found is that I didn't really have a clear idea about what direction my analysis would bring me to. What I mean by that is I didn't exactly do enough research before I started writing my history IA. As I was writing, I was actually also doing research along the way. So what I ended up doing is writing bits and pieces of my body paragraph as I was reading through my sources and trying to find information to support my overall claim. Therefore, I actually didn't write my introduction first. I wrote my body paragraphs before going back to write my introduction. You don't have to feel restricted to starting from the very beginning. Feel free to jump around. This tactic can also be helpful if you're having some writer's block. You can just jump from one section to another if you're feeling stuck, and that way you're still working and it doesn't hinder you in the process of writing your IA. Tip number 3 is to write your analysis first and then find evidence. I actually mentioned this in my previous video on general IA tips, but I cannot say this enough. It's a really underrated tip, but you should seriously consider writing your analysis first before you find the evidence, because finding evidence can actually be very tricky and time consuming. If you write your analysis first, you have a good idea of what evidence you should look for in order to support the general direction of your essay. Doing this will also let your own ideas shape the direction of your IA instead of basing your thoughts and claims on a source that you're reading. This creates a more unique exploration of the topic, and this complexity is something that IB really likes. I had a good general background knowledge about my topic, so I would write my analysis to further expand and introduce some nuance to my claim. After I finished writing my analysis, I would then go through the sources and do the command find function in order to find supporting evidence. Tip number 4, finding sources. Like I mentioned before, Wikipedia is a great source for finding sources because of its reference section and all its footnotes. If you find one section of the Wikipedia page interesting, you can figure out where the source was and see if you can find that book to use for your IA. I also really recommend that you use electronic sources instead of paper books for your history IA, because it's much easier to find corresponding information for your IA. If you have the electronic PDF copy, then you can just do command or control find. If you found these tips helpful, check out my other video about general IA tips and this video about Spanish or language oral tips for IB. Thanks for watching.